In the Gilded Age of American industry, one man built an empire not on steel or oil, but on chewing gum. William Wrigley Jr. turned a simple candy into a billion-dollar fortune and transformed his family name into an icon, forever linked with the legendary Chicago Cubs. His dynasty seemed invincible, but this is not a story of unchecked success. It is a story of how that very legacy became a curse, a tale of a son who couldn't win, a grandson who was forced to sell the family's soul to the tax man, and the eventual quiet disappearance of the Wrigley Empire into the hands of another. To truly understand the rise of a man like William Wrigley Jr., we have to transport ourselves back to the era that forged him, America's Gilded Age. This was a time of explosive change and brutal contrasts from the late 1860s to the turn of the 20th century. Railroads were stitching the continent together, and cities like Chicago were erupting from the prairie, their skylines pierced by the world's first skyscrapers. Fortunes in steel, oil, and finance were being made overnight by industrial titans like Carnegie and Rockefeller. But more importantly, this was the dawn of the American consumer. For the first time, mass production meant ordinary people had access to goods they'd never seen before, and a powerful new industry was born to convince them to buy modern advertising. It was a world that worshipped hustle, rewarded audacity, and believed that any man with enough grit could build an empire from nothing. It was into this simmering cauldron of capitalism and ambition that William Wrigley Jr. would throw himself, armed with little more than a belief in his own sales pitch. William Wrigley Jr. was born in Philadelphia on September 30th, 1861, just months after the start of the American Civil War. The city of his birth was a crucible of American industry and history, a place of Quaker discipline and industrial grit. His father, William Sr., was a man of the old school, a devout Baptist who had founded a small scouring soap factory. He was a firm believer in the virtues of hard work, thrift, and piety. Young William Jr., it seemed, was a firm believer in none of these things. From his earliest days, the boy was a maelstrom of untamable energy. School was his prison. He found the rigid structure, the rote memorization, and the confinement of a classroom intolerable. His mind moved too fast for the slow pace of formal education. He was a prankster, a troublemaker, and a constant source of frustration for his teachers. It wasn't that he was unintelligent, quite the opposite. He was fiercely bright, but his intelligence was practical, kinetic, and impatient. He was expelled from his grammar school so many times that it became a running joke. His father, exasperated, would lecture him, punish him, and then re-enroll him, only for the cycle to begin anew. The young Wrigley craved action and independence. At the tender age of 11, a time when most boys were still playing with marbles, he ran away from home. He made his way to New York City, the vibrant, chaotic heart of the Gilded Age. With no money and no connections, he survived on pure grit, sleeping on the streets and taking on the only job available to a boy of his size and age, a newsie, hawking newspapers on the bustling street corners. For a brief, cold, and hungry summer, he learned the first rule of sales. You have to yell louder than the next guy. He learned how to read a crowd, how to catch someone's eye, and how to close a deal for a penny. Eventually, the harsh reality of street life sent him back to Philadelphia, but the experience had changed him. It had stoked his self-reliance and given him a taste of the world beyond his father's factory. But his rebellious streak was far from tamed. At 13, his father decided the only way to instill discipline in his wayward son was through hard manual labor. He put young William to work in his own soap factory. The job was deliberately miserable, stirring huge boiling vats of soap with a giant wooden paddle. The heat was stifling, the smell was acrid, and the work was monotonous. For a boy with his restless energy, it was a special kind of hell. William Sr. hoped it would break his son's spirit and make him appreciate the value of an education. It did the opposite. It made William Jr. determined to escape the factory floor forever. He wanted to be the one selling the soap, not making it. He pleaded with his father for a chance to be a salesman. William Sr. was skeptical. His son was still just a teenager, brash and unproven. To test his mettle, he gave him the toughest assignment imaginable, the road. He equipped him with a horse, a wagon full of Wrigley's scouring soap, and a territory of small scattered towns throughout Pennsylvania, New York, and the New England states. This was the ultimate trial by fire. The life of a traveling salesman in the 1870s was lonely and arduous. The roads were often little more than muddy tracks, the inns were basic, and the merchants were shrewd and suspicious of fast-talking city boys. But for William Wrigley Jr., this wasn't a punishment. It was freedom. Out on the open road, he was his own boss. He thrived on the challenge. He discovered he had a natural gift for sales, a combination of infectious enthusiasm, genuine charm, and sheer bloody-minded persistence. He learned to read his customers, to understand their needs, and to tailor his pitch accordingly. He wasn't just selling soap, he was selling himself. He told jokes, shared stories, and built relationships. He also developed a unique sales philosophy. While other salesmen simply took orders, Wrigley would physically help the merchant set up a display, making his product the most prominent in the store. He understood visual merchandising long before the term was invented. He turned rejection into a game, vowing to never leave a town until he had sold something to every single merchant. His energy was legendary. He would drive his horse and wagon through rain and snow, often arriving in a town long after other salesmen had given up for the day. This grueling apprenticeship on the back roads of America was his true education. It was his Harvard and his Yale, and it taught him the lessons that would one day make him a millionaire. By 1891, William Wrigley Jr. was 29 years old. He was married, had a child, and possessed a confidence forged in thousands of sales calls. But he was restless. The East Coast felt old and crowded. He looked west towards the thrumming, chaotic, and electrifying city of Chicago. Chicago in the 1890s was the most American city in America. It was a place of staggering ambition and brutal realities. Having risen phoenix-like from the ashes of the Great Fire of 1871, it was now the nation's great crossroads, the hub for railroads, stockyards, and grain exchanges. It was a city of skyscrapers and slums, of immigrant dreams and industrial nightmares. For a man like William Wrigley Jr., it was paradise. The air itself seemed to crackle with energy and opportunity. It was a city that rewarded hustle, and hustle was Wrigley's native language. He arrived with a grand total of $32 in his pocket, a lifetime of sales experience, and a plan. He would establish a Chicago branch of his father's soap business. He rented a small office space and set out to conquer the city's merchants, just as he had the small-town shopkeepers of Pennsylvania. But Chicago was a different beast. Competition was fierce, and merchants were inundated with salesmen every day. Wrigley knew he needed an edge, a way to stand out from the clamoring crowd. It was then that he remembered a lesson from his days on the road. Everyone loves a bargain, but what they love even more is getting something for free. This led him to the business strategy that would define his entire career, the premium. His idea was simple. To convince merchants to stock his soap, he would offer them a free gift with a large enough order. His first premium was baking powder. He offered a can of baking powder with each box of soap. The strategy was an immediate success. Shopkeepers, who could then sell the baking powder for a profit, were more than happy to place larger orders for his soap. But soon, a curious pattern emerged. Wrigley, who paid close attention to his customers, began to hear the same feedback over and over. "We like your baking powder, but we've got plenty of soap." The freebie was more popular than the product it was meant to promote. A lesser businessman might have seen this as a failure. Wrigley saw it as an opportunity. If the market wanted baking powder, he would sell them baking powder. With breathtaking speed, he switched his entire business model. He found a manufacturer to produce baking powder under his own label and started selling it directly, relegating his father's soap to a secondary concern. His business acumen was proving to be as sharp as his sales pitch. And then, in a moment of commercial serendipity, history repeated itself, but on a grander scale. To promote his new baking powder business, Wrigley needed a new premium. He wanted something cheap, lightweight, and universally appealing. He settled on chewing gum. At the time, gum was a minor product, often sold as a novelty item. There were dozens of small manufacturers, but no dominant national brand. Wrigley struck a deal with the Zeno Manufacturing Company to supply him with small packages of gum. He began offering 2 free packs of gum with every can of his baking powder. The result was electric. The chewing gum was a sensation. Once again, Wrigley found that his customers were clamoring for the premium. Letters poured in from merchants asking if they could buy the gum directly. Children loved it, and adults found it a pleasant, modern habit. Wrigley had stumbled upon a product with near universal appeal and enormous potential for repeat business. This time, he didn't just see an opportunity, he saw a gold mine. In 1892, he made the most pivotal decision of his life. He abandoned the baking powder business, just as he had abandoned the soap business and staked his entire future on chewing gum. The W.M. Wrigley Jr. Company was born, and the world of consumer goods would never be the same. Wrigley knew that having a popular product wasn't enough. He had seen countless products come and go. To build a lasting empire, he needed to build a brand, a name that would be as ubiquitous and familiar as Coca-Cola was becoming. He decided to put his own name on the product, a common practice at the time, but he would market it with an uncommon zeal. In 1893, he launched 2 brands that would become American icons: Juicy Fruit, with its sweet, distinctive flavor, and Wrigley Spearmint, with its clean, refreshing taste. His competitors were mostly small-time operators who sold their products regionally. Wrigley thought on a national and eventually global scale. His strategy was twofold: massive, relentless advertising and a deep commitment to his network of retailers. He believed in the power of advertising with a religious fervor. While his rivals spent cautiously, Wrigley poured almost every dollar of profit back into promotion. His motto was simple: tell 'em quick and tell 'em often. He became a pioneer of modern advertising techniques. He was one of the first to use large, colorful billboards to plaster his name along the nation's highways and railway lines. He bought up ad space in the new mass circulation magazines and newspapers that were reaching millions of American homes. He blanketed streetcars with ads, knowing that he could capture the attention of a captive audience of commuters every single day. His ads were simple, direct, and memorable. They featured smiling, happy people, the Wrigley Imps, and clean, bold logos. The message was always positive, associating his gum with freshness, fun, and modernity. His most legendary marketing stunt came in 1915. In an effort to reach every potential customer in the country, he undertook a logistical marvel. He acquired every telephone directory published in the United States, and over the course of several months, his company mailed a free 4-stick package of his gum to every single one of the 0.5 million people listed. It was a direct mail campaign on a scale that had never been attempted before. The cost was enormous, but the impact was immeasurable. Overnight, the Wrigley name was in homes from Maine to California. He followed this up in 1917 by sending free gum to a staggering 7 million people who were on various mailing lists he had acquired. He wasn't just waiting for customers to come to him. He was putting his product directly into their hands. He also understood that advertising alone wasn't enough. He had to keep the thousands of merchants who sold his gum happy. He saw them not as clients, but as partners. He continued his use of premiums, offering retailers everything from cash registers and scales to lamps and razors in exchange for large orders. He created beautiful glass display cases for his gum and gave them to stores for free, ensuring his product was always front and center on the counter. He treated his own sales force like royalty, paying them well and fostering a culture of intense loyalty. He knew that a happy salesman would fight harder for shelf space than a disgruntled one. This combination of relentless advertising and dealer loyalty was unstoppable. By the turn of the 20th century, the W.M. Wrigley Jr. Company was the largest chewing gum manufacturer in the world. William Wrigley Jr. was no longer just a salesman from Philadelphia. He was the undisputed chewing gum king. His wealth grew to staggering proportions, but his energy never waned. He was constantly looking for the next big thing, the next way to expand his empire and solidify his legacy. As his fortune swelled, Wrigley began to invest in projects that went far beyond chewing gum. He built the stunning terracotta-clad Wrigley Building on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, a gleaming white tower that became an instant architectural icon and a bold statement of his success. He bought a controlling interest in Santa Catalina Island, a 22-mile-long island off the coast of Southern California, which he developed into a major tourist destination. But his most personal and enduring investment was in his other great passion, baseball. Wrigley had always been a sports fan, and he saw in baseball the same values he admired in business: competition, teamwork, and a connection with the American public. In 1916, he bought a minority share in the Chicago Cubs, one of the city's two Major League Baseball teams. At the time, the team was owned by restaurateur Charles Weechman, who had built them a new steel and concrete ballpark on the north side, then known as Weeman Park. As he had done with his business, Wrigley wasn't content to be a silent partner. He became increasingly involved, and by 1921, he had bought out his partners to become the sole owner of the team. He approached the Cubs with the same philosophy he applied to his gum business: give the customers a quality product and a pleasant experience. He poured money into improving the ballpark, expanding the seating, and making it a more comfortable and welcoming place for fans, particularly women and children. He was a hands-on owner, frequently attending games and making his presence felt. He believed the ballpark itself was a form of advertising. He wanted it to be a beautiful, clean, and happy place, a friendly confine, as it would later be called. In 1926, in a move that was both a tribute to the city and a brilliant act of branding, he renamed the stadium Wrigley Field. The name stuck, becoming one of the most iconic and beloved venues in all of sports. For Wrigley, owning the Cubs was the ultimate civic gesture. It cemented his status as one of Chicago's leading citizens and tied his family's name to the city's heart in a way that even a skyscraper couldn't. Under his ownership, the Cubs enjoyed a period of great success, winning the National League pennant in 1929. Wrigley reveled in it, not just as a businessman, but as a genuine fan. He had conquered the world of business and had now reached the pinnacle of the sporting world. In January 1932, at the age of 70, William Wrigley Jr. died in his sleep at his winter mansion in Phoenix, Arizona. The force of nature was finally still. He left behind a global empire, a vast fortune, and an iconic name. But he also left a world plunging into the Great Depression and an heir who now had to face that storm alone. The comet had burned out, and an impossibly long shadow now fell across his son, Philip Knight Wrigley, a man who could not have been more different from the father who had built everything around them. An empire forged by a force of nature is a difficult thing to inherit. Philip K. Wrigley, born in 1894, grew up in a world his father had built from scratch. He never knew the hunger of a runaway newsie or the grit of a traveling salesman. His childhood was one of immense privilege, spent between the family's grand mansion on Chicago's Lakeshore Drive and their sprawling estate in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Yet it was a childhood lived in the inescapable shadow of a perpetually energetic and demanding father. William Jr. adored his son, but was a man who cast a shadow so vast it could blot out the sun. Philip was groomed from birth to take over. His education was first-rate, culminating in a degree from Yale's prestigious Sheffield Scientific School. He was brought into the company early, learning the business not from the muddy roads, but from the corporate offices in the gleaming white Wrigley building. He even served in the U.S. Navy during World War I, becoming a lieutenant in naval aviation, a role that suited his meticulous, detail-oriented nature. He was, by all accounts, intelligent, diligent, and possessed a quiet integrity. But he lacked his father's fire, his easy charm, his innate love for the spotlight. While William Jr. thrived on handshakes and public pronouncements, PK preferred memos and careful analysis. He was an administrator at heart, not a showman. When his father died, the 37-year-old PK inherited the presidency of the W.M. Wrigley Jr. Company and the ownership of the Chicago Cubs. The timing could not have been worse. The United States was in the icy grip of the Great Depression. 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. Businesses were failing by the thousands every single day. The boundless optimism of his father's era had evaporated, replaced by a pervasive sense of fear and uncertainty. PK was immediately thrust into a trial by fire. The question on everyone's mind, from Wall Street to the bleachers at Wrigley Field, was whether this quiet, unassuming heir had what it took to protect the kingdom his father had built. His approach was immediately different. While his father had run the company on instinct and charisma, PK was a manager. He relied on research, data, and long-term planning. He understood that in a time of economic hardship, the company's greatest asset was its reputation for quality and value. He also subscribed to his father's seemingly paradoxical advertising philosophy. The time to advertise the most is when people are buying the least. While competitors were slashing their advertising budgets to conserve cash, PK doubled down. He kept the Wrigley name and its simple positive message, a small, affordable pleasure in a difficult world, in front of the public eye. The strategy worked. The Wrigley Company not only survived the Depression, but solidified its market dominance, weathering the economic storm with remarkable stability. PK proved to the world that while he may not have been his father's clone, he was a shrewd and capable leader in his own right. But a far greater global crisis was looming, one that would test his principles in a way the Depression never had. The entry of the United States into World War II in 1941 presented the Wrigley Company with an existential threat. The war effort demanded immense resources, and many of the key ingredients for high-quality chewing gum were suddenly classified as strategic materials. Sugar was strictly rationed. High-grade chicle, the natural gum base imported from Central America, became difficult to procure. Even the foil wrappers, were needed for the war. P.K. Wrigley was faced with a stark choice. He could either change his formula and produce a lower quality gum under his flagship names, Spearmint, Doublemint, and Juicy Fruit, or he could cease production for the public. For many companies, the choice would have been simple: substitute ingredients, maintain production, and keep the profits rolling in. But for PK, the Wrigley name was sacrosanct. It was a synonym for quality, a promise his father had made to the American people. To sell an inferior product under that name was, in his mind, a betrayal. In a business decision that remains a legendary case study in brand management, PK made a radical choice. He announced that the Wrigley Company would be pulling its three main brands from the civilian market for the duration of the war. Production of Spearmint, Doublemint, and Juicy Fruit would be redirected entirely to the U.S. Armed Forces, sent overseas as a small comfort and familiar taste of home for the troops. He explained his decision to the public with remarkable transparency, stating that since he could no longer guarantee the pre-war quality they expected, he would not sell them the product at all. To fill the void on store shelves, he created a new temporary brand. He called it Orbit. The packaging clearly stated that it was a wartime quality product, made with the best ingredients currently available, but that it was not up to the usual Wrigley standard. It was an act of extreme commercial honesty. PK was betting the entire reputation of his company on the idea that the public would respect his integrity more than they would miss his product. It was a massive gamble. He risked losing an entire generation of customers to competitors who were more than willing to sell a subpar product. But the gamble paid off spectacularly. The public saw his move not as a weakness, but as a patriotic and honorable act. When the war ended and the classic brands returned to the market, unchanged and as good as ever, the public's loyalty to the Wrigley name was stronger than ever before. PK had proven that long-term integrity could be more profitable than short-term gain. He had protected his father's legacy by being willing to temporarily sacrifice it. While PK was safeguarding his chewing gum empire, he was facing another wartime crisis in his other domain, baseball. With millions of men serving overseas, including many of baseball's biggest stars like Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio, the future of Major League Baseball was in jeopardy. Team rosters were depleted and attendance plummeted as the nation focused its attention on the war. There was a very real fear among team owners that the sport would simply fade from the public consciousness. P.K. Wrigley, ever the planner, saw the problem and conceived of a solution so radical and forward-thinking that it remains one of the most fascinating chapters in sports history. If the men couldn't play, maybe the women could. The idea was to create a professional softball league for women that could fill the ballparks and provide entertainment for a weary, war-torn nation. He presented the idea to other MLB owners who were skeptical but desperate. They formed a committee with Wrigley at its head to explore the concept. In 1943, the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, AAGPBL, was born. This was far more than a simple replacement league. It was a unique cultural experiment. Wrigley and his associates wanted to present a product that was both athletically credible and acceptably feminine by the standards of the 1940s. Scouts were sent across the United States and Canada to find the best female softball players, but athletic talent was only half the equation. The women selected were required to attend a charm school run by Helena Rubinstein's salon. They were taught proper etiquette, how to apply makeup, and how to style their hair. On the field, they were required to wear short, flared skirt uniforms, which were impractical for sliding but deemed essential for audience appeal. A strict code of conduct was enforced. No smoking or drinking in public, no unchaperoned fraternizing, and always look like ladies. The game itself was a unique hybrid. It started as underhand pitching softball on a softball-sized diamond, but evolved over the years, adopting overhand pitching and other rules that made it much closer to baseball. The level of play was remarkably high. The women were gifted athletes who played with a fierce competitive spirit, and the public responded. In its first season, the AAGPBL drew nearly 200,000 fans. By its peak after the war, it was drawing close to 1 million fans a season. The league kept the spirit of baseball alive on the home front and gave hundreds of women the chance to be paid professional athletes at a time when such opportunities were virtually non-existent. Though the league eventually folded in 1954 as post-war America returned to a more traditional normalcy, its existence was a testament to P.K. Wrigley's vision. It was his greatest and perhaps most uncharacteristic innovation. The quiet, conservative businessman had become a revolutionary pioneer in women's sports. It was a legacy of inclusion and opportunity that stood in stark contrast to the legacy of frustration he was simultaneously building just a few blocks away at his beloved Wrigley Field. If the Wrigley Company was the embodiment of PK's success, the Chicago Cubs were the symbol of his enduring frustration. He loved the team with a deep and genuine passion, but his vision for what it should be often clashed with the fans' desperate desire for a winner. For PK, baseball was not a business in the traditional sense. It was a pastoral daytime spectacle, an affordable escape for the working families of Chicago. He famously and fiercely resisted installing lights at Wrigley Field for night games, long after every other ballpark had done so. Baseball is a daylight game, he would insist, believing night games would attract a rowdier, less family-friendly crowd. His philosophy extended to the players. He believed in building a team through his farm system, nurturing talent from the ground up. He disdained the emerging concept of free agency and the idea of buying a championship by paying exorbitant salaries for established stars. This approach, which he saw as principled and sustainable, was increasingly seen by fans as simply being cheap. For a brief shining moment, it seemed like his way might work. In 1945, as the war was ending, the Cubs, as led by stars like Phil Cavarretta and Stan Hack, won the National League pennant and were headed to the World Series against the Detroit Tigers. The city was electric with anticipation. It was during this series that a seemingly trivial event would spiral into the most famous curse in American sports. A local tavern owner and avid Cubs fan named Billy Sianis, owner of the Billy Goat Tavern, tried to bring his pet goat, Murphy, into Wrigley Field for Game 4. He had a ticket for the goat, and it had become a local good luck charm. However, other fans complained about the animal's odor, and Sianis and his goat were ejected from the ballpark. Furious, Sianis allegedly threw his arms up and declared, "The Cubs, they ain't gonna win no more." They lost that game, and they went on to lose the series to the Tigers in 7 games. And then they just kept losing. Year after year, decade after decade, the Cubs sank into a state of perpetual mediocrity. The 1945 World Series would be their last appearance for the rest of the 20th century. The curse of the Billy Goat became a convenient, if folkloric, explanation for the team's endless failures. But many fans laid the blame squarely at the feet of the owner. For the next 32 years of his life, P.K. Wrigley would preside over this long, slow decline. His traditionalist approach seemed increasingly out of step with modern baseball. While other owners like the Yankees' George Steinbrenner were aggressively building dynasties through trades and free agency, Wrigley stood firm. His attempts to innovate were often quirky and unsuccessful, like his College of Coaches experiment in the early 1960s, where he replaced the single-team manager with a rotating committee of coaches, a plan that resulted in chaos and more losing seasons. The man who ran his gum business with such meticulous, forward-thinking precision seemed trapped by tradition and nostalgia when it came to his baseball team. The public perception of him soured. He was seen as an aloof, out-of-touch patrician who cared more about the balance sheet and the quaintness of Wrigley Field than he did about putting a winning team on it. It was a painful and deeply unfair caricature, perhaps, for a man who genuinely loved the team, but it was a narrative born of decades of frustration. He had inherited a successful team from his father, and on his watch, it had become a national punchline. In April of 1977, Philip K. Wrigley passed away at the age of 82. He died the respected head of a global corporation and the lamented owner of a failing baseball team. He left behind a legacy of integrity and innovation, but also one of stubbornness and sporting failure. And as his lawyers and accountants began the complex task of valuing his vast estate, they uncovered the poison pill hidden within his success. The massive, asset-rich estate he was passing on to his son, William Wrigley III, was about to trigger an equally massive tax liability, a financial crisis that would pose a greater threat to the family's legacy than any depression, war, or baseball curse ever had. A legacy is a living thing. It breathes, it grows, and sometimes it can begin to suffocate its inheritors. When Philip K. Wrigley died in 1977, he passed on to his son not just the keys to a kingdom, but the accumulated weight of 86 years of success and expectation. The man who inherited this burden was William Bill Wrigley III. Born in 1933 and educated at Hotchkiss and Yale, Bill was a stark contrast to his predecessors. He was a quiet, intensely private man, ill-suited to the public role his name demanded. He took the helm of a company that was a model of stability and a baseball team that was a model of futility. But hidden within the ledgers of his father's vast estate was a ticking time bomb, a financial threat born not of market competition or bad business, but of the cold, impartial mathematics of the United States tax code. Bill Wrigley was about to discover that the price of inheriting a billion-dollar empire was that you could be forced to sell its soul. Like his father, he was educated at the best schools, attending the Hotchkiss School in Connecticut, before following the family path to Yale University. He was a stark contrast to both his grandfather's boisterous showmanship and his father's methodical intellect. Bill was defined by his quietness. He was reserved, unassuming, and deeply uncomfortable with the spotlight that his surname inevitably attracted. Friends and colleagues described him as a gentleman of the old school, polite, dignified, but ultimately unknowable. He was a man who preferred the background, who listened more than he spoke, and who seemed to carry the family name more as a responsibility than a privilege. He dutifully entered the family business, working his way up through various departments, learning the intricate machinery of the global chewing gum enterprise. He became president and CEO in 1961 at the young age of 28, though his father PK remained as chairman and the ultimate authority until his death. For 16 years, Bill operated under his father's watchful eye, managing the day-to-day affairs of the company while PK focused on his broader philosophies and his beloved, frustrating Cubs. It was a long apprenticeship, and when PK died in 1977, Bill was fully prepared to lead the Wrigley Company. What he was not prepared for was the financial cataclysm his father's death would unleash. The problem was a concept that plagues many dynastic families. They were asset-rich but cash-poor. The Wrigley family's net worth was colossal, estimated to be close to $500 million in 1977, the equivalent of several billion today. But this wealth was not sitting in a bank account. It was almost entirely composed of two things: a controlling block of stock in the publicly traded but family-dominated Wrigley Jr. Company, and the private ownership of the Chicago Cubs baseball team. When P.K. Wrigley died, his estate became subject to federal inheritance tax, and in the 1970s, the estate tax was a fearsome beast. The top tax rate on large estates was a staggering 77%. While various deductions and exemptions existed, the final bill was guaranteed to be astronomical, running into the tens of millions of dollars. The Internal Revenue Service, IRS, had a very firm rule. The tax had to be paid, and it had to be paid in cash. The Wrigley estate simply did not have that kind of liquid cash on hand. Their fortune was tied up in stock certificates and the deed to a baseball team. To raise the necessary funds, something of immense value had to be sold. The first and most obvious option would have been to sell off a portion of the family stock in the Wrigley Company, but this presented a critical problem. The family's shares represented the controlling interest in the company. Selling off a large block of stock on the open market would not only depress the share price, but it would also dilute their control, potentially leaving the company vulnerable to a hostile takeover. For Bill Wrigley, whose primary duty as the new patriarch was to protect the core family business his grandfather had built, this was an unacceptable risk. Selling control of the Wrigley Company to pay the taxes on it was a self-defeating prophecy. That left the other major asset, the Chicago Cubs. From a purely financial perspective, the choice was logical, if brutal. The baseball team, while culturally significant, was a financial drain. It consistently lost money, and the salaries of players were beginning to explode across the league, promising only greater losses in the future. Unlike the company stock, the team could be sold as a single clean asset to a new owner without affecting the family's core business. The cold, hard numbers all pointed in one direction. To save the kingdom, the crown jewel had to be sacrificed. The decision weighed heavily on Bill Wrigley. He was not a baseball man, in the way his father and grandfather had been. He didn't share their deep personal passion for the game, but he understood what the team represented. It was the living embodiment of the Wrigley family's connection to the city of Chicago. His grandfather had bought the team, built it up, and put his name on its hallowed ballpark. His father had stewarded it for 4 decades. To be the Wrigley who sold the Cubs was to be the one who broke a sacred 80-year-old trust. For nearly 4 years, the family and their lawyers wrestled with the IRS and explored every possible option. They negotiated payment plans and searched for loopholes, but the reality of the massive tax bill was inescapable. The deadline loomed. Reluctantly, Bill Wrigley began the quiet, painful process of finding a buyer for the Chicago Cubs. He wanted to find a local owner, someone who would, in his words, be a better owner than he could be, and who was committed to keeping the team in Chicago and preserving the unique character of Wrigley Field. The search led him to the Tribune Company, the powerful Chicago-based media conglomerate that owned the Chicago Tribune newspaper, WGN, television and radio, and other media properties. WGN had been the broadcast partner of the Cubs for decades, televising their games across the nation. The Tribune Company had the deep pockets to absorb the team's financial losses and invest in its future. More importantly, it was a Chicago institution. The negotiations were conducted discreetly, but in the spring of 1981, the news finally broke, and it hit the city like a physical blow. On June 16, 1981, the Tribune Company formally purchased the Chicago Cubs from the Wrigley family for $20.5 million. In a quiet, understated press conference, a visibly uncomfortable Bill Wrigley explained the family's decision. He spoke of the profoundly sad moment and the enormous inheritance tax problems that had forced his hand. He expressed his hope that the new corporate ownership would finally bring the city the championship he and his father had failed to deliver. The public reaction was a mixture of sadness, anger, and resignation. For generations of Chicagoans, the Wrigleys were the Cubs. Their ownership, for all its frustrations, represented a link to a simpler, more romantic era of baseball. The team was a family trust, not a corporate asset. Now it was being sold to a faceless media giant. Sports columnists lamented the end of an era. Fans called into radio shows, some blaming the government for its tax policies, others accusing the Wrigley family of abandoning them. The sale was seen as the ultimate victory of cold, hard business over civic sentiment. The friendly confines of Wrigley Field suddenly felt a little less friendly, a little more corporate. The soul of the team, many felt, had just been sold to pay a tax bill. Bill Wrigley, a man who loathed the public eye, became the reluctant face of this civic trauma. He was the Wrigley who gave up, the one who broke the chain. It was a label he would carry for the rest of his life, a heavy burden for a man who had only done what he felt was necessary to protect his family's primary legacy. He had saved the company, but in the process, the family's name was forever removed from the team they had defined for nearly a century. After the sale of the Cubs, Bill Wrigley retreated even further from public life. He turned his full attention to the chewing gum business, running the company with a steady, conservative hand. He was not an innovator in the mold of his grandfather. The era of splashy, groundbreaking marketing campaigns was over. The company's strategy under his leadership was one of cautious expansion, risk management, and the preservation of market share. He focused on international markets and operational efficiency, guiding the company through the increasingly competitive landscape of the 1980s and 1990s. The world of consumer goods was changing rapidly. Corporate raiders were gobbling up established brands, and giant food conglomerates were using their scale to dominate supermarket shelves. The Wrigley Company, while still powerful and immensely profitable, began to look like a relic from another time. A large, independent, family-controlled company in an age of multinational giants. Bill Wrigley's great achievement during this period was simply holding the line. He fended off takeover rumors and kept the company independent, preserving the family's control in an era when other family dynasties, like CBS and Revlon, were falling to corporate takeovers. He remained chairman, president, and CEO, a concentration of power that was becoming rare in corporate America. He ran the company from the iconic Wrigley Building, but he did so with a quiet, almost reclusive style. He rarely gave interviews and avoided the Chicago social scene. He was a devoted family man, but his life was marked by private tragedy, including a difficult divorce. He was a man of immense wealth who seemed to take little public joy in it. The brash, optimistic energy of his grandfather was gone, replaced by the quiet, weary sense of duty of a man maintaining a fortress. To the outside world, he was simply the head of the gum company. The vibrant, complicated, and emotional connection to the city through the Cubs had been severed, and with it much of the family's public persona. The Wrigley name, once a daily presence in the city's sporting life, became just a brand on a pack of gum and a name on a building. The end for Bill Wrigley came as quietly as he had lived. In March 1999, while battling a persistent case of pneumonia in his apartment at the Drake Hotel, he passed away. He was 66 years old. His death was sudden and unexpected, marking the definitive end of an era. He was the last Wrigley to have known life with the Cubs as a family birthright. He was the last to have been personally groomed for leadership by PK. He was the man who had made the impossible choice, who had traded the city's heart for the company's future. He left behind a company that was financially sound and still independent, but a family legacy that was diminished and disconnected from the city it had once so thoroughly embodied. With his death, the immense weight of the Wrigley empire, the global company, the iconic brand, and the complicated history now shifted to a fourth generation. His son, William Wrigley Jr. II, known as Bill Jr., a man then in his mid-30s, would be the one to lead the family business into a new millennium. He was inheriting a powerful company, but also one that was increasingly an island in a sea of corporate sharks. The forces of globalization and consolidation that his father had successfully held at bay were gathering strength, and the final dramatic act of the Wrigley family dynasty was about to begin. A dynasty does not often end with a bang, but with a spreadsheet. It ends with a shareholder meeting, a press release, and a transaction so large it becomes an abstraction. As the 20th century drew to a close with the quiet passing of William Bill Wrigley III, the leadership of the family empire fell to a fourth-generation heir, William Wrigley Jr. II. Known as Bill Jr., he was a modern executive for a modern age, Harvard-educated and armed with a global perspective his predecessors never had. He inherited the company his great-grandfather had built on a handshake and a gimmick, the company his grandfather had defended with stubborn principle, and the company his father had preserved through painful sacrifice. But he would preside over it in an era of consolidation, a time when storied independent family firms were being devoured by multinational behemoths. He would not face a depression, a world war, or a tax crisis. He would face a force far more relentless and impersonal, the unstoppable logic of the 21st century global market. Bill Wrigley Jr., born in 1963, was the first of his line to be groomed for leadership in the contemporary corporate world. Unlike his intensely private father, Bill Jr. was more comfortable in the public role of a modern CEO. After graduating from Duke and receiving his MBA from the prestigious Wharton School, he worked his way up the corporate ladder, not just within Wrigley, but with a stint at the investment bank Morgan Stanley. He understood the language of Wall Street, of mergers and acquisitions, of shareholder value, a language that would become crucial to his tenure. When he formally took over as CEO following his father's death in 1999, he inherited a company that was a paragon of financial stability, but was viewed by some as staid and overly conservative. The world of candy and confections was now a battlefield of giants. Companies like Nestlé, Kraft Foods, Hershey, and Cadbury Schweppes were engaged in a global arms race, acquiring smaller brands and leveraging their immense scale to control distribution and marketing. In this environment, the W.M. Wrigley Jr. Company, for all its history and profitability, was beginning to look vulnerable, a prime target for a hostile takeover. Bill Jr. knew that the hold-the-line strategy of his father was no longer sustainable. To survive, Wrigley had to grow. He embarked on an aggressive expansion plan, a departure from the cautious management of the past. He professionalized the executive ranks, bringing in more outsiders with fresh perspectives. In 2002, he pushed for Wrigley to purchase its rival Hershey, a move that would have created a global confectionery superpower. The deal ultimately fell through due to opposition from the Hershey Trust, but it signaled a new, more aggressive posture from the Chicago gum maker. His biggest move came in 2005, when he orchestrated a $1.5 billion acquisition of several candy brands, including the iconic Lifesavers and Altoids from Kraft Foods. It was a major strategic pivot, moving Wrigley beyond its dominance in gum and into the broader confectionery space. For a time, it seemed to work. The company's revenues grew, and its product portfolio was more diverse than ever. Bill Jr. was proving to be a capable and forward-thinking leader, a worthy heir to the family name. He was playing the modern corporate game, and he was playing it well. But the game itself was changing, and the sheer scale of his competitors meant that even as Wrigley grew, it was still being dwarfed. The pressure from Wall Street and the ever-present threat of a takeover never fully subsided. The central tension of Bill Jr.'s leadership was the conflict between family history and shareholder reality. The Wrigley Company was publicly traded, yet the Wrigley family, through a special class of stock, still held effective voting control. This allowed them to steer the company with a long-term vision, insulated from the quarterly demands of Wall Street analysts. It was this structure that had allowed his father to keep the company independent for so long. But it also created a situation where the company's stock price might not reflect its true breakup value, what it would be worth if sold to a larger entity. As the 2000s wore on, the logic of a merger became increasingly compelling. A larger parent company could provide Wrigley with a vast global distribution network, greater leverage with retailers, and the capital to compete in emerging markets. For the Wrigley family, a sale would represent the ultimate diversification of their assets, transforming their concentrated single-stock fortune into billions of dollars in liquid cash, securing the family's wealth for generations to come, free from the risks of the volatile chewing gum market. The perfect suitor emerged from an unexpected place. It wasn't a publicly traded rival or a private equity firm, but another fiercely private, family-owned confectionery giant, Mars Incorporated. Based in McLean, Virginia, Mars was the maker of global mega brands like M&M's, Snickers, and the Mars Bar. Like Wrigley, it was a multi-generational family business built on a foundation of quality and brand loyalty. But it was far larger and more diversified. Crucially, Mars was a powerhouse in chocolate, but relatively weak in the non-chocolate confectionery space where Wrigley dominated. The synergy was perfect. Wrigley's brands would fill a major gap in the Mars portfolio, and Mars's colossal distribution network could push Wrigley products into new corners of the globe. For Bill Jr. and the Wrigley family, a deal with Mars was uniquely appealing. Selling to another private, family-controlled company felt different from being absorbed by a faceless public corporation. There was a shared culture, a belief that Mars would be a respectful steward of the Wrigley brand and its Chicago heritage. And of course, there was the price. Mars, seeing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to corner the global confectionery market, was prepared to make an offer of stunning generosity. The news, when it broke on April 28, 2008, was a blockbuster. Mars Incorporated announced that it would acquire the W. Mend Wrigley Jr. Company for approximately $23 billion in an all-cash deal. The offer of $80 per share represented a massive 28% premium over Wrigley's closing stock price, a number so large it was virtually impossible for the board to refuse. The deal was a masterclass in financial engineering, backed by a name even more legendary in the world of finance than Wrigley was in gum, Warren Buffett. Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway helped finance the deal, lending Mars billions of dollars and taking a minority equity stake in the newly acquired Wrigley subsidiary. The involvement of the Oracle of Omaha gave the transaction an unimpeachable seal of approval. The terms were designed to signal a partnership of equals, even though it was an acquisition. The Wrigley Company would continue to operate as a separate, standalone subsidiary from its historic headquarters in Chicago. Bill Wrigley Jr. himself would remain with the company, transitioning to the role of executive chairman. It was a soft landing, a way to preserve the legacy and the identity of the Wrigley brand while the ownership officially changed hands. In Chicago, the news was met with a familiar sense of civic melancholy. First the Cubs, now the company itself. Another of the city's great independent family-run institutions was being sold. It was the end of a 117-year-old story. But there was also a sense of inevitability. In the hyper-competitive landscape of 21st century capitalism, the Wrigley Company's independence had been living on borrowed time. The sale was the logical conclusion to the story. For the Wrigley family, it was the final profound act of their dynasty. The rebel great-grandfather had built a company out of nothing. The principled grandfather had protected it. The dutiful father had sacrificed a piece of it to save the whole. And now, the modern son had converted the entire century of accumulated history, branding, and effort into pure, liquid capital. The family name was no longer attached to a global enterprise they controlled. It was now simply a brand, a very, very valuable brand, owned by someone else. And so the family dynasty ended. Bill Wrigley Jr. eventually stepped down from his role at the new Mars-owned Wrigley, and the family that had been synonymous with Chicago industry for over a century faded gracefully from public life, their fortune secured for countless generations to come. The story, it seemed, was over. But history had one final poignant postscript to write. On the cool autumn night of November 2nd, 2016, the city of Chicago held its breath. The Chicago Cubs, the team the Wrigleys had owned for 65 years, the team they had sold to save their company, were playing in the 10th inning of the 7th and deciding game of the World Series. For decades, they had been the lovable losers, the team of the Billy Goat curse, the team that always found a way to break its fans' hearts. And then they won. The city erupted in a joyous, cathartic roar that had been held back for 108 years. The longest championship drought in the history of professional sports was over. The curse was broken. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated sporting bliss. And it was a moment the Wrigleys were not there to see as owners. The destiny that William Jr. had dreamed of, that PK had fruitlessly chased for 40 years, and that Bill III had been forced to relinquish, had finally been achieved. It was the ultimate irony. The championship came only after the family was long gone, under a new ownership group that had the resources and the will to spend whatever it took to win. Today, the Wrigley name is more ubiquitous than ever. The gleaming white Wrigley building still stands majestically on Michigan Avenue. Wrigley Field, now a National Historic Landmark, is a sold-out cathedral of baseball every summer, the name of its founding family chanted by millions. And in countless stores across more than 180 countries, you can still buy a pack of spearmint, doublemint, or juicy fruit. The brands, the buildings, and the ballpark all remain permanent fixtures in the cultural landscape. They are monuments to the ambition of a restless salesman from Philadelphia. The Wrigley saga is more than a business story. It's a sweeping, multi-generational tale about the arc of American capitalism itself. It's about the raw, creative energy that builds an empire, the dutiful stewardship that sustains it, the painful choices required to preserve it, and the impersonal global forces that ultimately absorb it. It's a story that proves that a name can become more powerful than the family that created it, and that a legacy can sometimes only find its truest fulfillment after its authors have already left the stage. It is the story of how the simplest of products, a stick of chewing gum, created one of the most complex and enduring of all American dreams,